Hello and welcome to Keep Left, the podcast that looks at politics, especially American politics, from the left end of the spectrum. I'm John O'Connor. Today is July 26th, 2024, and we'll go back to looking at Project 2025 and what delights it has for those of us on the left side of the spectrum, and why we should care about it and vote against it every way we can. Today, we're going to be looking at a little bit more of the dry stuff about the personnel goals of this. And I want to spend some more time on this in part because it's kind of the more insidious part aspects of Project 2025. The idea is that they want to impose a lot more friendly people into the bureaucracy, people who might take over some of the parts of American bureaucracy and drive it into the ground. In Britain, you've seen some critiques of conservative government with respect to the National Health Service, the sort of socialized medicine of Britain, in that the Conservative Party has sort of underfunded NHS and thereby making it long waiting lines, thereby trying to get the public against it so that the Conservative Party can then come back and then scrap it because, well, the people are against it. And I think there's a little bit of that here as well, which is that they think that by putting their own people who are essentially against the very notion of bureaucracy and against the very notion of effective bureaucracy, that they can get people against the very idea of it. And we'll start out by looking at we're now in chapter 3, central personnel agencies managing the bureaucracy, with two heavyweights writing this. My assumption is that the guy in the middle, Dennis Dean Kirk, actually wrote it. Donald Devine is a person familiar to anyone who's been following the conservative movement since the Reagan days. He was in charge of the bureaucracy during the Reagan administration. He was known for doing his best to chop jobs off the federal bureaucracy. One could argue that it was a little bloated after 25 years of expansion, or one could argue that it was a way of handling an ever expanding need as the economy was expanding, as the need was expanding, as the government was expanding, as the whole country was expanding. But he has been at the forefront of not just the practicalities of how to limit the reach of government, but also the theory behind it. You can look at his Wikipedia page, you can look at a lot of the publications that he's written. He's very much at the forefront of limiting government to very few things, just in terms of a policing function, a legal function, and a military function, and that's it. No other functions for government. Dennis Dean Kirk is a man who is on the presidential transition team for Project 2025. Almost certainly, you did similar sort of personnel jobs for the Trump administration during the Trump's term in office. Paul Dans similarly had a couple of roles with the Trump administration at a higher level. Was hired without letting certain people in other positions know about it. And is also Paul Dans is also the person who is pro forma in charge of Project 2025 for a lot of this, the writing of this, and for the what to do with the presidency aspect of it in terms of transition from the Biden administration into the putative Trump administration. So let's look at what they're looking at. Again, we're going to just sort of touch on some of these things. A lot of it is dry. A lot of it is perfunctory. There's a lot of language talking about how immense the bureaucracy is. A lot of loaded language getting at, trying to set the stage for why we should pare it down. They touch on sort of the various organizations that are at the top of the federal bureaucracy. And they touch on the history of it, and I happen to know a fair amount about it. The federal bureaucracy prior to 1883 was a mess, and it was a spoils system, such that every 4 years the entire system would change essentially. Now, to be fair, it wasn't a particularly large system. The federal government was primarily set up for ports, for postal services. If you, a very good example of what it was really all about is actually if you watch the movie Lincoln. There's a good chunk of it where Lincoln is handing out jobs, and that is really what the president was doing a lot of the time, was finding jobs for people and trading favors. It was literally a spoils system. And one of the reasons it changed was in 1880 when Garfield, who had been elected partially on the promise of reforming the system, was assassinated by a certified insane person named Charles Guiteau, who had given a drunken speech in favor of the Garfield candidacy and therefore felt he should be rewarded, was not rewarded, and therefore killed Garfield. And that caused the Pendleton Act of 1883, which was then put into law in other places. And the idea was that it wasn't just progressives that sought a system that could effectively select, trade, reward, and guard from partisan influence. Everyone, I think, thought that the spoils system prior to 1883 was corrupt. And it wasn't just Republicans and Democrats or Whigs before that. Every party, every person saw that, every time the administration changed, whoever was running the postal region changed, whoever was running the Port of Baltimore changed. And so you didn't have any administrative knowledge from 4 years to 4 years. And so people would literally get rich off of it because you had 4 years to make money under the table, to give licenses to your friends, and then when the 4 years was up, you could sort of grab your wallet and your money and go off into the hills, and the next person would come in and do the same thing for the next 4 years. And so it was crying out for some sort of more bureaucratic expertise where you could actually get experts and give them a decent salary so that they wouldn't be subject to bribery and so forth. And so it was, and so the sort of pejorative language here, this idea of progressives have sought a system that could effectively select, train, reward, and guard from partisan influence the neutral scientific experts they believe are required to staff the national government and run the administrative state, as if implying somehow that bribery and corruption are a progressive versus conservative question. I mean, it almost seems like they're suggesting that conservatism is synonymous with corruption. You can read that and make your own judgment, obviously. And so you have the situation set up where, the Pendleton Act is done, and it was further institutionalized in the 1930s because over those 50 years between the 1880s with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and the New Age, the New Deal era, where you have America now becoming this huge multi-factor economy with international commerce, steel, rail, air, all these things that need to be coordinated, and huge amounts of protections for workers, trying to keep competition going on. You now had a larger and larger bureaucracy, and not just in commerce, but also in everything from the Veterans Administration, forestry, agriculture, all the system as we more or less know it today. And so, it was set out that they would have these principles and practices that were meant to ensure that merit rather than partisan favors or personal favoritism ruled within the federal bureaucracy. Now, I find it interesting that there's nowhere in here where they say that is a good thing, right? That is the neutral language here. They immediately skip to, yet as public frustration with the civil service has grown, generating calls to drain the swamp, it has become clear that their project has had serious unintended consequences. It was devised to replace the amateurism and presumed corruption of the old spoils system. Folks, it was corrupt. You read any history of that era, the Gilded Age, as they call it, it was corrupt. It was corrupt as all get out. Um, uh, uh, and so, although the system appeared to be sufficient for the nation's first century, progressive intellectuals and activists demanded a more professionalized, scientific, and politically neutral administration. Progressives designed a merit system to promote expertise and shield bureaucrats from partisan political pressure, but it soon began to insulate civil servants from accountability. Well, I think there's an argument to be made. I think that you have to find a balance between shielding civil servants from political witch hunts. I absolutely think there's an argument to be made where you have to have a system set up so that civil servants can be judged on their performance. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that they are insulated from political interference. And it's hard sometimes to distinguish between the two. So, where do you want to put your thumb on that scale? There's this interesting paragraph where, uh, after the Carter presidency was winding down, the U.S. DOJ and top lawyers at the OPM contrived with the plaintiffs to end civil service IQ exams because of the concern about their possible impact on minorities. But Carter administration officials, probably without the president's informed concurrence, abolished this through a legal consent court decree capitulating demands by the civil rights petitioners who contend that it was discriminatory. The judicial decree was to last only 5 years, but still controls federal hiring and it applied to all tests even today. Bear in mind, remember, I said one of the writers of this had the ear of Reagan at the time of all this happening, but I guess he's absolving himself of any involvement in that. Bear in mind that all legitimate studies talking about IQ tests have shown that there is no correlation between IQ tests and actual intelligence or capabilities or competence. If you do well on an IQ test, that just means you can do well on an IQ test. It means you have a brain that is good at doing those kind of logic tests. That's all it means. Good on ya. And you've got a brain for that kind of thing, and that's cool and all, but you may not have a brain for, say, flying an airplane or a jet fighter, or maybe good for playing chess, but not necessarily for painting a picture, right? Or processing mail, or accounting, right? Or all these other things that civil servants do. IQ may have nothing to do with any of that. General ability tests like that have been used successfully to assess the usefulness and cost effectiveness of broad intellectual qualities across many separate occupations. Citation needed. There's no citations here again. And then there's a rail against what is called disparate impact. And that's you can do a whole course, a law course on disparate impact. But essentially, it's something in employment discrimination law where you can show where a test was used that has a disparate impact on a particular class of people that thereby effectively discriminates against that class of people. And then it shifts the burden on the defendant or the employer to show that there's a non-discriminatory purpose for that test. It's just a burden shifting thing. If you can't come up with a reason for the test, then you lose, right? And that's all there is there. Like it's nothing more than saying, hey, it's essentially a recognition of the fact that employers sometimes do things that are discriminatory but cover their tracks, right? And as a way to sort of get around that, as a way to catch those employers, what they do is they just say, hey, look, if you've adopted a test and you've covered your tracks pretty well, but this test does seem to exclude African American people or women or, I don't know, Irish people or Catholics or, Baptists, whatever. We want to know why you've adopted this test. Give us a reason. Give us any non-discriminatory reason. You got one? Well, you're clear. I mean, that's all that means. Um, and then there's it moves on to and by the way, conservatives hate the test. The conservatives think that you need to show intent to discriminate in order to have a valid discrimination claim. But what is that? How do you show intent? How do you, short of pejorative language in the email, short of I'm doing this because I hate all blank, fill in the blank people. Um, People in employment situations, although it's not always the case, aren't usually that dumb. Um, I did want to talk about how there are some things that sound okay, but also in the wrong hands can be bad. Like we're talking here about Executive Order 13839, and I want to point this out for two reasons. One is that one of the complaints about Biden and Obama from people in conservative groups was that uh, Obama and Biden are dictators because they use executive orders all the time. Throughout this entire Project 2025 manual, you will see them praising President Trump for using executive orders everywhere. Um, but here you do have some things that do sound okay in a vacuum, right? Um, Reduce executive order reducing the time for employees to improve performance before corrective action could be taken, to initiate disciplinary actions against poorly performing employees more expeditiously, to reiterate that agencies are obligated to make employees improve, to reduce the time for employees to respond to allegations of poor performance, to mandate agencies remind supervisors of expiring probationary periods, to prohibit agencies from entering into settlement agreements that modify an employee's personnel records, and to reevaluate procedures for agencies to discipline supervisors who retaliate against whistleblowers. Um, Now, I don't see like finding efficiencies in a disciplinary process in and of itself. I don't think sounds bad. A lot of it would depend, though, on what time frame we're talking about, right? If we're saying we're trying to bring it down from 6 months to 3 months, I think I can understand that. And I'd have to dig in to find that executive order to find out what the time frame is. If, on the other hand, you're bringing it down from 6 months to a week, okay, well now we have to talk, right? Um, Regardless. Um, One of the things that they're after here, and I find that very interesting, is that they're trying to switch from a government salary basis for these jobs to a um, uh, private sector basis for the jobs. So, for the people who don't know, one of the things about working in government for a number of years and decades is that the idea is that if you go into government, you are getting less of a salary than if you stayed in the private sector for similar types of jobs. But in exchange for that, your job security was greater because typically governments don't go out of business. Uh, Also, your benefits were more guaranteed than they would be if you went into the private sector because, again, typically governments don't go out of business. Um, and your other benefits like health, vacations, and so forth were better because you typically didn't get bonuses, right? There's no profit margins from working for government. So, if you work for a private sector company and there was a huge profit, chances are, as an employee, you get a great season, year-end bonus. You don't get that in government, so you would get extra vacation days, or better health care, or earlier retirement age, right? That was sort of the trade-off there. So you might only be making half of, or three-quarters of what you could have made working in the private sector, um, but the trade-offs would be worth it because you had better benefits, retirement benefits, and better hours. Um, And here they're noting that Fortune 500 companies don't offer any employer contributions at all for retirement. And again, yes, that is the trade-off that we're talking about here. And the obvious solution is to move closer to a market model for federal pay and benefits. I suppose one other option would be for private sector to move closer to a public sector model for pay and benefits. But why would we want to do that? And what they're trying to do here, it seems, is move all of the federal benefits for employees closer to private sector. It's unclear why they want to do that. There's no explanation as to why that should be in here that I was able to find, other than it should be that way because there's discrepancies, ignoring the reason for the trade-off. And then they get into the thing that Jon Oliver covered in his show a couple weeks ago, or months ago at this point, talking about burrowing in employees. This idea that, and it says here, that somehow Democratic administrations are more successful because they require the cooperation of careerists who generally lean heavily to the left. Such burrowing in requires career job descriptions for new positions that closely mirrors the functions of a political appointee, a special hiring authority that allows the bypassing of veterans' preferences, as well as other preference categories, and the ability to frustrate career candidates from taking the desired position. Again, citation needed. There's no citation here. And again, the idea here is that they're trying to say that there are some positions in federal government that are usually satisfied by left-leaning people because the careerists in the government are left-leaning, and therefore they're essentially holding the door open for leftists and not rightists. Again, no citation for this, and their solution for this is to change Schedule F. And the idea is that they're trying to widen the scope of who can be hired and fired as political appointees. And again, this is what they say when it here, director of the Office of Personnel Management and agency heads to set procedures to prepare lists of such confidential policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating positions and prepare procedures to create exceptions from civil service rules when careerists hold such positions from which they can relocate back to the regular civil service after such service. And again, the reason to do that is to get those careerists, those leftist careerists, out of those positions so they can get Republican people into those positions and run them the way they want to. And a large part of that is because what they found was civil servants were saying, no, you can't do what you want to do because it is against the procedures at every level of government. They weren't following orders because those went against what they were supposed to do, and Trumpistas wanted it done regardless of what the rules were. You have this section here. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because it'll be interesting to see just sort of how it pans out. But essentially what here they're saying that there probably shouldn't be public sector unions, arguing that FDR himself didn't really think there should be public sector unions. He talks about how President Trump wasn't daunted by public sector unions and issues some executive orders sort of limiting what unions could do in terms of not working on government time and encouraging agencies to renegotiate all union collective bargaining agreements, and sort of talking about management rights, which is usually a subterfuge in different language for squashing workers' rights. And here's the giveaway. Congress should consider whether public sector unions are appropriate in the first place. The bipartisan consensus up until the middle of the 20th century held that these unions were not compatible with constitutional government. After more than half a century of experience with public sector union frustrations of good government management, it is hard to avoid reaching the same conclusion. Love the passive voice, folks. Love the passive voice. And here again, you've got this thing about staffing the ranks of political appointees, about having an issue with Trump getting his appointees confirmed or even considered by the Senate, and not removing political appointees from the previous administration, relying on prior political appointees and career civil servants to run the government. And in part, most of them did their jobs in a fairly neutral way, because most of the things the government does actually don't involve policy determinations. It's just making sure Amtrak runs, and making sure that the checks go out on time. And I think this is sort of the most important thing. Is it's the one to highlight, and where a lot of this comes down, and why Project 2025 is here, why it incorporates a resume collecting function. Personnel is policy. That's it. It's their idea that the reason why the Trump administration was a failure wasn't just incompetence. It was because they didn't have the people to fulfill their aims. And so the lesson they're learning is to get all those people together who can do this job of pursuing their policies and get them in position as quickly as possible. Personnel is policy. Ignore the rules, and if you can't ignore the rules, change the rules, change the personnel plans, change the union codes, change the laws, reform the bureaucracy. Personnel is policy. As part of that, they argue that bureaucracy cannot even meet its own civil service ideas. The merit criteria of ability, knowledge, and skills are no longer the basis for recruitment, selection, or advancement, while pay and benefits for comparable work are substantially above those in the private sector. Again, citation needed. I don't know anywhere that that's the case, frankly. Retention is not based primarily on performance, and for the most part, inadequate performance is not appraised, corrected, or punished. And the suggestions here could bring that bureaucracy more under control and be able to work more efficiently and responsibly, which is especially required for the half of the civilian government that administers its undeniable responsibilities for defense and foreign affairs. We'll be getting to that. Absolutely. And then they close out by saying, the progressive system has broken down in our time, and the only real solution is for the national government to do less. To decentralize and privatize as much as possible, and then ensure that the remaining bureaucracy is managed effectively along the lines of the enduring principles set out in detail here, which again, break the unions, get rid of careerists, replace them with fellow travelers, and fire anyone you don't like. That's what we're looking at here, folks. Personnel is policy. And by the way, there is no corruption in a spoils system, and we should probably reform how we look at people in the civil servants, and fire them faster. So that's what we're looking forward to in this civil service system that they're putting together. We'll continue through there, and we'll also touch base on what's going on in presidential politics at the beginning of next week. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening. Hit like and subscribe. I think I'm supposed to say at some point. But this has been John O'Connor. Keep calm, keep fighting, and keep left.